Welcome to Boston Children's Answers Parentcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Arnold. As a doctor and a mom, I'm passionate about helping kids stay happy and healthy. So join me as I chat with other Boston children's experts to find answers for you and your family. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us as we get ready to talk about kids and sleep, two things that don't always seem to go well together. As in previous episodes, we'll start things off with a question. Today's comes from Chris, a dad to a 6-month-old baby girl.
Hi, Dr. Arnold. My wife and I have a 6-month-old girl, and sleeping has been a roller coaster since she came home. From waking up half a dozen times during the night to teething issues, and now most recently flipping from her back onto her belly. We've experienced all of these things so far. My question is, what can we expect going forward in the next 6 months? And more specifically, when will she be able to put herself to sleep?
Oh, poor Chris. That is a great question. I think all parents have struggled at one point when it comes to getting their newborn or even their teenager, like me, on a proper sleep schedule. Luckily for us, we have an in-house sleep specialist who knows about all things sleep related. I'm excited to introduce our guest expert, Dr. Judith Owens. Dr. Owens is senior faculty at the Center for Pediatric Sleep Disorders here at Boston Children's Hospital and a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure, Jen.
Oh, thank you. So before we dive into sleep, I'm curious, you started off as a pediatrician. How did you become interested and focused in your career on sleep?
I think it really was an outgrowth of my experience as a fellow in developmental behavioral pediatrics. And then I also did a fellowship in child psychiatry. And I realized that 80% of my patients with ADHD or autism or depression, anxiety, had sleep problems. And I had no training on how to deal with those. So it was really on-the-job learning experience.
Wow. And then now you are, you're part of one of the very first sleep clinics in the nation, if not the world. So, how does one get their career to go down this path of sleep medicine?
Well, we are now fortunate enough to have sleep medicine fellowships.
Oh, wow.
And these fellowships are typically 1 year. Many of the trainees have done work in pediatrics or in pulmonary medicine or in neurology, and their interest has been piqued during their training, like mine was, and they decide to do a fellowship.
That's amazing. Well, I think one of the things I may have talked to you about is that I actually, our kids come to the clinic here because they both have sleep challenges. So I'm excited to be talking to the right person about this topic. It's near and dear to my heart. So with that, I want to start off with our first question. I feel like, being a neonatologist, I get asked this question all the time. How much sleep is enough sleep for our children?
Based on an extensive review of the existing evidence, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine has published a list of sleep ranges for different ages. These recommendations are for optimal sleep, for optimal functioning. For toddlers, the range is 11 to 14 hours over 24, so that includes naps. In the next age range, which is 3 to 5-year-olds, preschoolers, it's around 10 to 13 hours of sleep. And for school-age children, 9 to 12, with school-age children being defined as 6-year-olds through 12-year-olds. And typically, within those age ranges, the younger you are, the more sleep you need. There is some variability from one child to another in the same age range about how much sleep they actually need. So several ways that parents can gauge that is, number one, does the child wake up in the morning at the time that they need to without an alarm, without multiple reminders, and seems well rested, in a good mood, ready to go? Number two, do they show evidence of daytime sleepiness? And we know that in younger children in particular, that could include things like hyperactivity or acting out behaviors or mood dysregulation. And then the third thing, which I think is really critical for everybody, is when you're given an opportunity to get more sleep, you take it. That really is a sign that you're not getting enough sleep on a regular basis when you sleep 2 or 3 hours later on the weekend, for example.
I can definitely see some things I need to be evaluating with my own kids' sleep so that I can hopefully help them to ensure that they're getting the right amount.
Sure.
Because school performance and everything like that, I imagine, can be impacted if your child's not getting enough sleep.
Absolutely. It's amazing how many areas are really impacted by not only getting enough sleep, but getting sleep at the right times. It's not just how much you sleep, it's when you sleep that's important. And if you're not sleeping at the right time, then you're going to have many of the same consequences that insufficient sleep might cause.
As we're talking about the amount of sleep, when to go to sleep, how to, encourage getting a good amount of sleep, why is it so important to get that good, right amount of sleep?
Well, on a very basic level, there is really nothing that replaces sleep. And I'll give you an example of that. There's something that was recently discovered in the brain called the glymphatic system. And essentially, that seems to be a process by which accumulated toxins and also experiences and images during the day are reduced, giving the brain a clean slate, if you will, from which to operate the following day. And that glymphatic system is only working during sleep. We also know that sleep affects what we call plasticity in the brain, which is the ability to change structure and function according to your experiences. It affects the brain's ability to repair itself from injury or stress.
Oh, wow.
And so that, of course, is going to have a very important impact on things like cognitive function and attention and memory. Insufficient sleep or mistimed sleep also affects essentially every system in your body. So it affects your heart, metabolic function, so immune function. So your susceptibility to getting sick is impacted, as well as your response to vaccines. So if you don't get enough sleep before you get a vaccination, your response to that might be slowed, which can be really very relevant.
So important. I think what I'm taking away here is that sleep does a body good, all aspects of your body and your health. I think about the hours that I spent as a resident, working 30 hours in a shift and not sleeping, and then I would know I'm going to get sick, right? Because when I have a lot of shifts like that in a row, your body's worn down, but it's really the lack of sleep that doesn't allow your immune system to be at its best.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And another example, when people aren't sleeping well, they have a lower tolerance to pain. They're less likely to recover from painful episodes. So it has this incredibly important impact all across the board.
So this is really, I think, why it's important to talk about sleep and why it's important to help our kids get enough sleep. So, for teens and tweens, what is the right amount of sleep? How can we help our kids get that right amount of sleep?
They need between 8 and 10 hours of sleep a night. And we know that the vast majority all over the world don't get nearly that amount of sleep. But that is such a critical period for a number of reasons. Because, for example, something called executive functions in the brain are at their highest level of development during the teenage years. And these are functions like the ability to monitor your behavior, emotional regulation, the ability to make good decisions.
Complex tasks, right?
Complex tasks.
Yeah.
It affects risk-taking behavior, which of course we all know is such a big issue in teenagers. And so just at the time where they're going through this important stages of brain development, they're exposed to what I call a toxin of insufficient sleep. The parents ability to influence their children's sleep starts way before the teenage years. Having a bedtime routine that includes reading and doesn't include electronics. And then as parents, really helping to emphasize to children that sleep is just as important as good nutrition and physical activity.
In our family, sleep has probably been one of the top topics for us because both of my kids have sleep challenges.
Yes.
And part of their skeletal dysplasia is that they have obstructive sleep apnea.
Yes.
And so we had to seek help really early on. Just you can see night and day when you can tell, they've worn their CPAP, they've gotten to bed on time, what the next day is like compared to the days that doesn't happen. It's a challenge, I think, for parents to figure out how to navigate when they were younger, but it was harder just to get them to wear their CPAP. Now, as I'm older, it's harder for me to get them to stop playing their video games and being on their screens. So back to this older population of kids and teenagers and tweens, how can we help to encourage that good habit forming sleep behavior without being overbearing as a parent?
Well, yes, and that's definitely a challenge, but I think there's a carrot and a stick approach. The stick approach is really to be vigilant about your teenager's sleep habits. And I talk to so many parents who are asleep well before they're teenager, and they really have no idea what time they're actually going to bed and falling asleep. So that's one issue. Being a good role model in terms of sleep. I think turning off electronics. So not only are they stimulating, but they also emit blue light, which is one of the most important things that actually shuts off your brain's release of melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that really is instrumental in helping you to fall asleep. Now, I know that a lot of kids have homework that they have to use the computer for, but even using things like blue light blocking glasses or apps can help with that process. Not doing things in bed other than sleeping. So don't do your homework in bed, don't be on your cell phone in bed, don't watch TV in bed. The carrot part is you are likely to be a better athlete and to be less likely to get injured. And that we have data about that if you get enough sleep. You're more likely to do better in school. Even your mood is improved, so that's sometimes can be the hook that gets kids to pay attention to the, every kid has different things that are priorities for them, but if you can link those priorities with the likelihood that sleep is going to make them better, then that helps a lot.
I think that's the key. I definitely try to find the common ground, the thing that is going to make them excited to sort of, listen to what mom and dad are saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think unfortunately they get caught up in this whole peer thing where it becomes a badge of honor to get less sleep. I stayed up and I did an all-nighter. We have to change the culture to a certain extent. And I think that's happening because teenagers can be your best allies in terms of making structural changes like delaying school start times that really benefit students. That dates back to the 60s when they developed tiered busing systems. And somebody had to go first. So the logic at that time was, well, we'll have the older kids go first and we'll have the younger kids go last. And teenagers, of course, have this normal shift at puberty to a later sleep onset and wake time. So it's exactly counter to what we should have done, but now we have that information. So we have to make the changes.
What do you think would be the ideal start times for schools based on different ages?
Well, certainly for teenagers, what we advocate strongly for is 8:30 or later. Typically, teenagers aren't really ready to fall asleep until about 11 o'clock. And you can do the math. If they need 8 or 9 hours of sleep, then they're not going to be able to get up much before 7 or even 8 o'clock in the morning. This applies to middle schools as well because it's so tied to puberty, this change in sleep patterns. And so many middle school students are going through puberty as well.
Yes.
So in terms of younger kids, maybe somewhere between 8 and 9 is reasonable. But right now, many elementary schools start even later than that. And so these kids are up and ready to go at 6:30. And, they don't end up in their seats in class until 9:30. So that's 3 hours of wakefulness and alertness that just goes to waste.
Yes, I 100% agree, and I'm living that right now. So, having said that, though, if you're in a situation where your kids have a start time that may not be ideal, what are some tips to help them wake up and be as alert as possible in the morning?
So one of the things that's very important is light exposure. Particularly natural light will help to suppress your brain's release of melatonin. And you want that to be the case, whereas at night you want to have that melatonin operating to help you fall asleep. So if it's dark in the morning or in your room, turn on all the lights. I am not a fan of a snooze alarm. And I think you just get terrible sleep after you click the alarm for another 10 minutes and then another 10 minutes and then another 10 minutes. Just set your alarm for the time that you actually have to get up so you get your REM sleep in particular. So REM, or rapid eye movement, or dream sleep, is concentrated in the last third of the night. So that's another issue with teenagers, because if they have to wake up too early, they lose that REM sleep. REM sleep is critical for learning, and especially learning of new tasks. And that's what kids have to do all day long in school.
They need that REM. So,
absolutely.
So having said that, okay, besides the fact that I am guilty of hitting the snooze, and I'm going to work on this myself, I'm going to use that tip with my teen as well. What about going to bed? Using Will as our example, what tips do you have for helping me to help him get to bed at a good hour?
Yes, so we talked a little bit about electronic use, and if at all possible, ideally they should go off an hour before bedtime, but at least a half an hour before bedtime, and that should also allow you to have some calm down time. We all need a period of time where we can kind of easily fall into the process of going to sleep. And I always wonder when my patients say, well, I try to fall asleep. The actual act of falling asleep should be just a natural thing and not require work to do it. So in order to allow you to be in a mindset and a physical sense ready to fall asleep, just doing something, whatever is relaxing for you.
Okay, so tell me about this one concept that I've heard, which is something called the forbidden zone. Can you tell us and our audience more about what that is?
Yes. So it also goes by the term the second wind phenomenon, which I think most parents will say the light bulb goes off. Yep, I know what that looks like. So we all have a surge in circadian alertness the hour or so before our brains are ready to fall asleep. That kind of counter surge of alertness allows us to stay up that extra hour. Now, if you try to put a child to bed during that so-called forbidden zone, it's much more likely to be difficult. And you get the curtain calls. I need another drink. I need another story. I need another hug. I have to tell you something.
Yes.
We as parents, we all know the drill. But parents can often interpret that surge in energy as, oh, they're overtired, when in fact, it's almost the opposite, that you're not over that period of time of alertness where they're then ready to fall asleep. So sometimes, much to the horror of parents, we actually recommend a later bedtime because then you get over that period of time when they're just not ready to fall asleep.
It's so hard, especially when the parent wants to go to bed early.
Exactly.
But we have to pay attention.
The trade-off is you don't get those curtain calls. You keep them up a little longer, they relax, they calm down, and then they fall asleep.
Yeah, and bedtime's much more pleasant.
It is indeed. Another key is that many teenagers, for example, will exercise just before bed.
Oh, yeah.
And so vigorous exercise actually raises your core body temperature and makes it more difficult to fall asleep. And also not going to bed hungry, having a protein filled snack at bedtime is also helpful. And caffeine. So, a lot of teenagers use these energy drinks, and many of these energy drinks have a very high caffeine content.
Yeah.
So particularly when they're using them in the afternoon or the evening, that's going to disrupt your ability to fall asleep and also disrupt your nighttime sleep as well.
Yeah. So limit that caffeine, down, you need calm time, no screen time, and, make sure you're not hungry, little protein. It's funny, some of these things I've done at different ages, but I have to say with my kids, I haven't been consistent. So I need to also, be consistent, I think, with these measures, right?
Yes, consistency is the hallmark of parenting in general,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And of course, one of the hardest things to actually achieve in reality.
Yeah, 100%. So I think we all can work on that. Well, I was thinking it might be good to go back, to our question at the top of the podcast from Chris. What advice do you have to help parents to get some sleep themselves by helping to encourage good sleep habits in their baby?
Absolutely. The 6-month mark is an important one because by that time, you can start sleep training. And sleep training goes under a variety of different guises, Ferberizing, for example, or cry it out method. But basically the idea behind that is to have the infant falling asleep, drowsy but awake, and having the parent leave the room. That avoids developing what we call sleep onset association. In infants and older children as well, whatever they need to fall asleep at the beginning of the night, and if that's parents' presence, for example, or having a bottle or being rocked or held, they will also come to need that during the night when they wake up. And all of us wake up periodically through the night as at the end of a sleep cycle. Now, the younger you are, the shorter your sleep cycle, so the more often you wake up during the night. So parents will come to me and say, oh, well, he wakes up 6 or 7 times a night. That's normal. What the problem is that the baby needs to be picked up or shushed or whatever in order to fall back to sleep, and that involves the parent getting up. So that whole process of putting the child to sleep so they fall asleep independently. And that we usually don't recommend that before 6 months of age.
Okay.
But at that,
makes sense,
you don't want to try that too early.
Yeah.
And also just knowing that healthy full-term infants don't need to be fed during the night as long as they're gaining weight appropriately.
Right.
So that's kind of a misconception that a lot of parents have.
Yeah, as long as they're growing and
Yes, exactly.
thriving. What about napping? When to do naps, how long? Because that's a hard thing too.
It is. So in general, babies under a year of age will take 2 naps a day, and that can sometimes last up to 18 months or so. And so usually there's a sort of mid-morning nap and a mid-afternoon nap. As a rule of thumb, we encourage parents to have wake periods of 3 to 4 hours in between naps, because that allows the baby to build up enough of a sleep drive so that they can then fall asleep at either the second nap or particularly at bedtime. So if the second nap lasts until 6 and you're trying to put the baby to sleep at 7, that's going to be a real challenge.
Makes sense.
So the other issue that comes up a lot is, when do children stop napping? It really amazes me how much that varies across children. So there are some 2.5-year-olds or 3-year-olds that stop napping, and there are some children who are 5 and are still requiring a nap. And there's often a transition period where they may nap some days and not others, and that kind of drives parents crazy because they don't know what to expect.
How to plan their day.
But that's kind of a natural process. Yeah. Now, if a child in general is napping much past certainly 6 years old, then that raises a concern about whether they're getting enough sleep at night or whether their sleep is disrupted. So that's a little bit of a red flag for parents to pay attention to.
Yeah, so after that certain age, if they're still needing naps, you might need to think about why is that the case?
Exactly.
And to seek help from someone like you. Yeah, no, the napping thing is really interesting because, I skipped the whole newborn period with my kids since I brought them home at 2 and 3. Will had done the napping so much longer. And my daughter, Zoe, she just did not want naps after the age of 3.5. And I was fighting it for a while, and then I realized, okay, maybe I don't need to fight this. And I just have to live with the fact that nap time is over.
Yep.
Shucks.
Move on.
Yep. As a parent. So it sounds like it is normal to be so variable.
It is.
For
Yes,
each child. That's really great to know. Well, I think one of the things that maybe all parents need to know is, what are the warning signs that maybe something, isn't good with their child's sleep?
I'm glad you brought that up. If a child seems to be getting the amount of sleep in the general range for their age, but they still seem sleepy during the day. So the other pieces are very important to look for symptoms that occur more during sleep. A lot of parents interpret snoring as a sign that their child is sleeping well, is sleeping deeply.
Deeply, yeah.
When in fact, it can be and is often the primary symptom for obstructive sleep apnea, particularly loud snoring and nightly snoring. So other things that go along with that are frequent nasal congestion, mouth breathing, which implies there's difficulty with breathing through the nose. Pauses in breathing, that's very important. So children who have obstructive sleep apnea will snore, pause, and then they may snort and kind of wake themselves up to start breathing again. That's constant disruption of their normal sleep quality. Other risk factors for sleep apnea include certain conditions that cause some narrowing of the upper airway. Increased size of the tonsils and adenoids is probably the most common reason for sleep apnea in children, but also allergies, asthma, a history of prematurity, and importantly, a family history of sleep apnea.
Is it worthwhile to define, for those that maybe haven't heard of obstructive sleep apnea, what exactly it is? I mean, I know my kids have it because, of the narrow midface that they have due to their skeletal dysplasia.
It basically is a failure to breathe normally during sleep. So there's some blockage or obstruction to breathing. And that can be from anything that results in that narrowed airway. The brain's response to not getting enough air and enough oxygen in particular is to wake you up and say, you better start breathing again.
Breathe harder, yeah.
Which is great, but it causes this disruption in sleep, and also you get these dips up and down in oxygen level all night long, which we know is not good for the developing brain.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we don't think of our kids as being at risk for sleep problems, but we really do need to be mindful and looking out for those signs and symptoms.
Yes.
And
And I would also mention, particularly in the adolescent population, that obesity can be a risk factor for sleep apnea, just as it is in adults. And as children age, we see more and more of that as being the major contributor to.
I'm curious if you want to share with families what to expect when they see a sleep doctor like you.
Absolutely. So we take a detailed history and ask about those symptoms as well as the risk factors, physical exam, and the gold standard really is an overnight sleep study that's done in a sleep lab that is experienced in studying children. Our techs are working with children with behavioral concerns, with very complex medical issues, and getting a very detailed snapshot of breathing, of sleep stages. So we have an EEG that's going to measure brain waves, oxygen level, body movements, leg movements, heart rate, respiratory rate. So we get a whole bunch of information from that one night study.
I have lots of pictures of my kids with all of the gear on. It's quite cute, I think.
Yes.
But they may not have thought so
Right,
during
I
the
was gonna
time.
say.
Okay, so going back to the sort of the topic at hand, there is something that we haven't talked about much yet, but I think is also something that a lot of parents want to know about, and that's the use of melatonin. Does melatonin help kids sleep at night? And if so, what patients or what kids should we think about melatonin as a supplement for?
Melatonin has become the go-to, I think, for many parents and pediatricians. And it does work in many instances, but there are a lot of caveats. Melatonin, for many children, is really more of a Band-Aid. And particularly if they have behavioral issues that are really contributing to the insomnia or the difficulty falling or staying asleep. While they're on the melatonin, they may fall asleep faster. They're probably going to continue to wake up at night. And when you stop the melatonin, the problem is still going to be there. Yeah. So it's really the behavioral interventions in many cases that result in a much more permanent treatment. So there are specific groups of children in which melatonin has been tested and found to be effective, primarily children with autism and children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They're fairly well studied. All the choices that we have, melatonin in general, very in general, is probably the safest and has the fewest side effects. But it's being very much overused in this country now. We really need to get some guidelines out there and to also warn families and healthcare providers that there are drawbacks. One of the biggest is because melatonin is over the counter in the United States, it's not well regulated.
Yep.
And studies have shown that the actual amount of melatonin is oftentimes not remotely what it says on the label, which is alarming, right? Yeah. And in most countries around the world, melatonin is by prescription only for that reason.
Interesting.
So given the Wild West of melatonin out there, I will recommend to families that they look for pharmaceutical grade melatonin because that's the type of melatonin that's been used in these studies. So that helps give you a little bit of peace of mind that what you're giving is actually the accurate dose.
Yeah.
Again, melatonin is pretty much only for falling asleep. There's some data from Europe that suggests it might help with staying asleep in an extended release form, but I'm a bit skeptical of that, I have to say. And from a physiologic standpoint, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that melatonin would help with night wakings. We really don't know what the long-term effects of someone having been on melatonin for 5-10 years as a young person. We don't think that there are major issues, but the studies have not looked at those kinds of long-term side
Sure.
effects.
Well, and I've also heard when it comes to melatonin, like you should try to give breaks, right? Because if you just give melatonin every night consistently, it starts to suppress your body's own melatonin production. Is that true, or is that?
Well, I've been asked about that, and I did some digging in the literature, and there really was very little to say yes or no. You think you give, artificial
Supplement.
melatonin, it suppresses your brain's release of melatonin. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. Really, the take-home message here is you've got to do the behavioral interventions, because otherwise it's really a Band-Aid.
Yeah. And we all want something easy, right? We want an easy fix.
The other thing that bothers me is when I hear kids say, well, they ask for their melatonin every night. And so the idea that a 6-year-old,
My kids did that.
has become dependent on a pill.
That's
right?
exactly what I was like, oh, we got to stop doing this melatonin thing, because I
yeah.
was like, this is weird. It's the gummy. It's just the gummy part that they liked about it. But I was like, oh, I never intended for them to actually then tell me they needed to have their gummy before they went to bed.
That's right. And, there was a
Guilty.
very interesting study published by the CDC that showed that the overdoses reported to poison control centers of children and melatonin have increased astronomically.
It's not
by
surprising.
500+%.
These little gummies, they taste good, they
Yep.
look good, and I think many parents don't, think of it as a medication.
That's right.
But it is. So be careful with the melatonin is the point.
Yes.
To use it judiciously if you're going to try it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So throughout the course of our conversation, we've talked a little bit about research related to wake times and school times, related to, healthy habits for bed and melatonin. Is there anything from a research perspective that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, there's tons. And, one of the most gratifying parts of my career has been to see this field of pediatric sleep medicine just explode. One group of studies that I oftentimes bring up with parents, especially of really young kids, are these longitudinal studies that have looked at the impact of sleep training in 6 months, 12-month-olds, 18-month-olds, and then they look at them 5 years later to look at things like cognitive development, attachment, emotional development, behavior, stress levels. And these studies do not show any evidence that there are long-term negative effects of these sleep training interventions. And I think that is very reassuring for parents who worry that if I don't respond to my child crying during the night, or I insist that they go to bed at a certain time, I'm being a mean person, a bad parent. And I get that,
Yes, it's
guilt
hard to
is
hear.
part of being a
Yes.
parent. But these longer term prospective studies have not seen any evidence that there are psychological effects. If there's evidence to suggest that that's not the case, then I feel better about going forward with this.
You're not causing other harms trying to do good in for another reason.
Right.
And that's important. So having said that, for parents that want to, learn how to do sleep training with their child, what resources would you recommend that they do?
I mean, there are a number of great books out there, and I have to give a shout out to my predecessor, Dr. Richard Ferber. Of course, the internet now is the major source of information for many parents. And I think because sleep training is at some level controversial, you can read a lot that says, you're harming your child by letting them cry and, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
So I think parents come away from that feeling very confused.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why, we encourage families to seek out professionals, health professionals who are trained in guidance. A lot of these interventions need support. So, you need to have a dialogue with parents about, there are several different ways you can do this. Yes. So you never dictate. You can come to a meeting of minds about what parents are going to be actually able to do. Because if you give them advice about leaving the room, or, don't take your child in bed with you, and they're just going to walk out of the office saying, no way am I going to do that. You want that conversation to happen before they leave.
Yes.
And also, my families can message me anytime once they get home, and they talk to dad or grandma about what they intend to do, and grandma says, how, you're going to let that baby cry at night? Yes. So they can reach out and get a little bit of reinforcement that they actually are, that they're actually doing the right thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it really does help to talk to an expert like you, because I think all of us, we just want what's best for our kids. Finally, as we wrap up, I thought I would ask one of the most important questions. Are there any long-term consequences of not getting proper sleep?
Well, unfortunately, I think the evidence is mounting that there are, and that can range from things like neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, and there is evidence to suggest that chronic insufficient sleep can increase the risk of dementia. We certainly know it's linked to cardiovascular consequences like high blood pressure and increased risk of heart attacks and strokes, type 2 diabetes. One of the things I worry about most in the adolescent population is car accidents. Accidents are now the number one cause of death in adolescents in the United States, and that includes motor vehicle crashes. And our team has done some work looking at that in relationship to school start times. And schools that change their start times to later, we can't say it's cause and effect,
sure,
but is associated with less risk for car crashes.
Interesting. Wow.
In those districts,
wow,
compared to other districts that did not change their start times.
Where the teens are drivers.
Exactly.
Wow.
Right. And the other is depression and mental health problems, which are also, suicide is the third highest cause of death in adolescents in the U.S., very sadly.
Yeah.
And so if we can prevent some of that by getting these kids enough sleep, it's hard to imagine anybody would object to that.
Absolutely. So, when should parents reach out to their pediatric sleep program?
The majority of the patients that I see are families with typically developing normal babies, kids, and teenagers who have sleep issues, insomnia, for example. Yeah. We also see lots of typically developing healthy children who have sleep apnea as well. Another sleep condition that can occur in children is called restless legs syndrome, which is characterized by an urge to move, particularly the legs, with oftentimes leg discomfort that occurs primarily at bedtime in the evening hours and causes trouble falling asleep. We know kids with ADHD, for example, have a much higher risk for having restless legs syndrome. And it's pretty generally easy to treat because it's oftentimes caused by low iron levels. Yeah. And so providing iron supplementation oftentimes takes care of the issue. Things like sleepwalking and sleep terrors, we do see a lot of kids with that, particularly if they're frequent. So there are a whole host running the gamut from infant sleep problems to sleep apnea to restless legs to narcolepsy, which is a condition caused by resulting in extreme sleepiness during the day. We see that whole range of problems.
Wow, you just listed a whole bunch of things that I think we could spend many more
We
discussions talking about, because it's just sleep is, as you mentioned, it's one of the most important things we can do for our health is to get good, healthy sleep. So thank you, Dr. Owens, for your time today.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Now on to the part of the show we're calling Doctor's Orders, where we prescribe you with ways to make you and your family healthier. Please remember that sleep is essential for the entire family, and that kids who regularly get an adequate amount of sleep have improved attention, behavior, learning, and overall mental and physical health. So, do what you can to encourage and model good sleep by trying to go to bed at the same time every night, removing distractions like screens, and establishing a bedtime routine. Consistency is key. The toughest part, but key. Thanks for listening, and a huge thanks to our guest parent, Chris, as well as our guest expert today, Dr. Judith Owens. If you'd like to hear more, be sure to subscribe to our show. Be well, everyone.